Well, my dear friends, Easter is almost upon us, so what better time to learn some more of the Vatican's deepest, darkest secrets? Time once again to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen. The document I'm about to leak has been highly guarded for centuries and contains sensitive information regarding the Catholic Church's knowledge about life after death. It is written by a Byzantium priest named Quintus Aurelius, who was charged by the Roman Emperor Constantine in the year 335 AD to discover, through experimentation, what information he could about heaven and hell. Sensing his rapidly approaching death, the ailing Constantine wanted to know if his faith in God had been well placed. Given this urgency, he ordered the local order of priests to uncover the truth about the afterlife using any means necessary. What follows is Father Aurelius's account of his experiment. The document has been meticulously translated from its original Latin for readability. The results of my experiment must never be shared with the public. Their minds are too feeble to comprehend such hard truths, for I fear the Church's reputation would be tarnished. Our hold on the peasants is weak enough as it is. The last thing we need is for that vile mass of ignorance and superstition to go running back to the pagan gods that we've only so recently deterred them from worshipping. But I digress. Following my meeting with Emperor Constantine, I returned to my alchemy lab to begin my experiment. My goal was simple, to concoct a liquid that, upon consumption, first stopped the heart, then reanimated it minutes later. By creating this death simulation, as it's now been aptly labelled, my hope was that participants would ascend to heaven while their hearts rested in suspended animation, and then come crashing back to earth the moment their hearts resume their normal rhythms. Upon awakening, they would be able to share their experiences of the afterlife and hopefully prove the existence of heaven once and for all. Oh, if I would have known then how much my experiment would test my faith, I might have given pause. As it stands, I didn't think twice about the myriad of results my experiment might bring and began to develop my potion with fervor. Much to my delight, I devised the means of creating this potion by the end of the week and, after meticulously testing its efficacy on field mice, was ready to begin human trials. So I packed my bags, prepared my cart, and traveled to Petra, a secluded village deep in the countryside, to begin my experiment. The people of Petra are meek and pious. God himself couldn't select better test subjects. Hence, word of my arrival quickly spread, and soon I was swarmed in the village square by families begging to be blessed. Although I wanted to jump right into my experiment, I obliged these requests and blessed every dirt-smeared soul that supplicated themselves before me. Foregoing the blessings would have been rude. The Petrans are a superstitious people. They would have taken my refusal as a sign of God's anger and fallen into panic. Once the blessings were complete, I ascended a nearby podium and addressed the gathered families, who gazed up at me as if I was St. Peter himself. "People of Petra," I began, "I come to you bearing a marvelous gift. At the request of the Emperor, I have developed a means of gazing upon the opulent splendor of heaven. By drinking the concoction that I have packed inside my cart, your soul will be elevated to the pearly gates for several precious minutes, before easing back down to earth, bearing spiritual knowledge thought previously to be beyond human discernment." I paused as excited murmurs echoed throughout the crowd. "Rejoice, for you are the only town that the Emperor has deemed fit to partake in such a holy pilgrimage. The piety and goodness of Petra is known throughout the empire. No other city is better deserving of God's grace. So, step up while time remains and consume the drink that Jesus Christ himself would have bestowed upon his disciples." Now the Petrans clamored towards my cart, pushing and shoving each other like children battling for a promised piece of candy. I administered doses of my potion as fast as my fingers allowed, until 10 minutes later every man, woman and child gathered in the square possessed a vial. "May God bless you all as you begin your journey," I said, reascending the podium. Raise your vials now and drink, carrying with you the goodwill of the Emperor." My heart quickened as the gathered crowd emptied their vials. Their eyes burned with excitement as the liquid splashed down their throats. Other than the faint whispering of the wind, which had picked up with the arrival of the setting sun, not a sound could be heard. One by one, the patrons tumbled to the ground as their hearts stopped. Although I gazed upon this dramatic spectacle with expectant eyes, my breath still seized at the sight of so many lifeless bodies languishing under the purple clouds. Even their chests were still. I was the only being in Petra that still drew breath. As the minutes ticked by and the still patrons laid lifeless before me, I began to fear that my potion had killed them. The hearts of the mice that had served as my initial subjects had only fallen dormant for 3 minutes. 7 minutes had now passed since the patrons had first downed their vials, and not a single soul had awakened. I cursed myself for performing my first human trial on such a large group of people. My excitement to uncover the truths that my potion had the potential to reveal had clouded my reason. Had my mind been operating with its normal precision, I would have begun my experiment on a single subject. Then, if the results had been favorable, would have proceeded to offer the potion to a population like the one laying before me now. As it stood, I had rushed blindly into a large-scale human trial, and now faced the possibility that I had unwillingly murdered an entire city of loyal Christians. Just as I was about to fall into despair, a woman near the back of the crowd inhaled a raspy breath, and sat up with such speed that I marveled that her neck didn't snap. Her eyes were wide with shock, and stress lines dominated her forehead. Moments later, another patron bolted up from the ground, whimpering and slobbering like a crazed lunatic. I flashed the man an admonishing look. He appeared to be in his mid-30s and should have known better than to delve into such histrionics in public. As he dashed his hands to his neck and tore out his own throat, though, my look of consternation quickly morphed into one of pure terror. I watched in stunned silence as more patrons regained consciousness. Their expressions ranged from shaken to downright crazed. A frenzied energy filled the air as dozens of blood-curdling shrieks sounded, sending the birds clamoring from the nearby trees and into the velvet sky. Never before had I witnessed such a chaotic scene. What follows is my account of these poor souls' initial reactions to my potion, which is burned forever in my mind like the vivid visions of a fever dream. The two men closest to the podium threw themselves down a nearby well and became wedged halfway down the stone shaft, which had been too narrow for them to travel fully down. Their spines cleaved in half as their bodies formed into right angles, chins and feet facing the sky while their bloated bellies arched down towards the tainted water. To my left, a half-dozen women pulled out their hair, thread by thread, until their scalps laid in tatters on their bloody shoulders. During the entirety of this sadistic spectacle, they babbled about eternal darkness and lakes of fire, making even my blood run cold. Before I had a chance to calm them down, they sprinted across the field, flanking the city, and hurled themselves off of a cliff. They laughed hysterically as they fell, but then their skulls struck the jagged rocks dominating the crooked gulch below, silencing them forever. 3 men near the middle of the crowd pounded their heads on the stone-filled ground until they fell unconscious. Blood poured from their wounds like crimson wine, as the panicked mass, thrashing around them, trampled over their limbs like stampeding cattle. All around me, the lives of the poor patrons were snuffed out in increasingly abominable ways, until eventually all that remained of the village were children, the mentally handicapped, and a handful of adults whose temperaments were hearty enough to endure the horrors that they'd witnessed during their pilgrimage. The monumental effort it took to regain order supersedes my ability to put into words. All the survivors could do was blabber, almost incoherently, about the visions of hell that had been inflicted upon them until their throats turned raw. The children, much to my surprise, remained remarkably serene, especially given the deaths of many of their parents. Suffice it to say that I eventually calmed everyone down and influenced those who remained to return to their homes, leaving me and a few volunteers to clean the square. After allowing the patrons 2 days' rest, I began my interviews. The information that they shared with me shook me to my core and has left me questioning my faith in God. If the surviving patrons didn't possess such reverence for the church, they would have crucified me for inflicting such profound suffering upon them. I had promised them magnificent visions of heaven, yet my potion had transported them to the deepest pits of hell. Whether this was a result of some unknown defect within my concoction, or sins on their own behalf, I did not yet know. After giving the survivors time to recover from their pilgrimage and mourn the dead, I ushered them in small groups to the picturesque church on the hill behind the village square to begin my interviews. Despite the massive tragedy wrought by the experiment, I still needed to procure what information I could from the patrons about the afterlife. Emperor Constantine fervently awaited my report. He is an impatient man, and one that I didn't want to anger. These interviews continued for days and took such a toll on my mental and physical health that I aged 10 years. Never before had my faith in God been tested so rigorously. Despair descended over me with each word that tumbled from the patrons' mouths. The picture of the afterlife they painted was not only bleak, but cruel, and defied everything I thought I knew about the Christian faith. Although I took extensive notes over the patrons' revelations, organizing and then transcribing these notes would take months. Given the importance of the information that I have to share, I've decided to only convey the high points, so to speak, of my interviews, which form a common narrative. May God have mercy on our souls. In the immediate moments after their heart stopped, a red light overcame the patrons' senses. They described this red light as originating from inside them and shuddered when I asked them to elaborate. Rather than give me the detailed description that I desired, all they would say was that the light felt evil. Not only did it send their nerve endings exploding with white-hot pain, but it also inhaled thundering, raspy breaths while yanking them into the abyss. As their life forces flooded from their bodies, they felt their minds, or possibly souls, detach from corporeality and descend into a dense black pain. Given that they were now bodiless, they were completely immobilized in this plane and subjected to what might be best described as infinite nothingness. According to them, time slowed down to almost a standstill in this darkness. They went through great lengths to persuade me that they spent the equivalent of dozens of lifetimes wallowing in this abyss, like rocks submerged in a murky lake. Just as they feared that what remained of their consciousness might tumult into insanity, a cacophonous tearing sound erupted over the plain, bringing with it the intense red light. Now, what happened next I can hardly commit to paper, for it defies everything I thought I knew about the natural sciences and Christian metaphysics. Given that Emperor Constantine himself is waiting on this report, though, I'll do my best to relate the entirety of the patrons' experience. Following this immense tearing sound, the patron souls were transmogrified into seeds of flesh, for I know not what else to call them. These seeds were about 1 inch in diameter and covered with minuscule orifices. They languished in despair as their consciousness were tethered to these seeds, which possessed no faculties for movement. All they could do was exist inside their newfound bodies, like the prisoners chained to the walls of Plato's cave. Before they hardly had time to adjust to their fleshy cages, these seeds rapidly expanded in size. This expansion occurred at such an explosive pace that they were ignorant of its cause. Soon their orifices resembled gaping holes, which burrowed deep into their wrinkled flesh like dank crevices. Out of these orifices first sprang a torso, followed by limbs and a head. Such pain accompanied the sudden growth of these appendages that the patrons visibly trembled as they recounted the experience. Their new bodies contained similar proportions to human beings, but possessed grey skin and were entirely sexless. Now that the patrons had regained sight, they could gaze upon the hellish world that they'd been resurrected into. A putrid yellow lake of boiling acid stretched as far as their eyes could see. Spanning this lake was an obsidian bridge, black as night, which began at the rocky ledge on which they now stood, and ended at the entrance of an equally black city. The spires of this city ascended miles into the cloudless red sky, and were sharpened into rough, jagged edges. Trundling along the bridge and into the city were millions of the recently deceased. Each one possessed a similar grey body as the patrons, and brandished intense looks of despair. The bridge groaned under their collected weight. No matter how many bodies were crammed onto its formidable surface, though, it held strong and rippled malevolently into the rancid yellow glow of the lake. Occasionally, someone would trip and go plummeting head over heels into this lake. They sent forth blood-curdling screams as their skin was scalded by its acidity, and were left flailing in the viscous liquid for an eternity. As a result, the lake was over-brimming with grey heads, which drifted along the desolate surface as their bodies slowly dissolved but never entirely disintegrated. The patrons were compelled to approach this bridge by an invisible force so powerful that it stole the air from their withered lungs. Their feet moved against their will, and before long they were crossing this bridge along with the endless sea of other unfortunate souls. When they reached the city, they were crammed into the bottom level of the spires like vermin. Before they could even assess their new surroundings, they were lifted and locked into harnesses, which bore them slowly towards a massive red door. No matter how aggressively they struggled against their harnesses' chains, they remained ensnared. The guttural cries of the dead frenzied into a crescendo as they were swept through the red door and disappeared into the room beyond. It was while in this room that the patrons first encountered the denizens of hell. The chains ensnaring the patrons' limbs groaned as the alien mechanism whirling above their heads carried them through the red door. They descended at a steep incline into a dank cave deep below the spire, which reeked of death and decay. Many of the patrons refused to continue their accounts beyond this point. What took place in this cave traumatized them, and they may never recover from the heinous crimes they were forced to endure. It was only after I depleted all of the persuasive techniques at my disposal that they agreed to resume their narratives. But even then, at least a dozen of the patrons suffered nervous breakdowns, which I fear may have forever shattered what remained of their sanity. Standing on jet-black platforms surrounding this cave were the demons of hell. Their appearances spanned from blindingly seductive to shockingly grotesque. Every few seconds their faces, or occasionally their entire bodies, would drastically morph, as if their human-like features were masks disguising their true forms. Only their sizes remained constant. Each demon towered 12 feet above the ground and cast desolate shadows along the cave walls. The patrons trembled as their harnesses bore them ever closer to these frightful beings. All around them the cries of the deceased echoed around the cave, which reached such volume that dust and bits of rock rained down from the vaulted ceiling. Immediately after the patrons cleared the red door, thick steel bars exploded from their harnesses and locked their limbs into place. So restrictive were these bars that they couldn't even turn their heads. All they could do was stare forward in frightful agony as the demons looming along the cave walls grew ever closer. Although I'm often lauded for my calm heart and stoicism, the agonies the patrons suffered at the hands of these demons causes me to shudder even now. No human beings, especially loyal Christians, should be forced to endure such calamities, As it stands, not even the Petrons' faith could save them from their fates, which were taking such a bleak turn that they could do nothing but lament their very existences. One by one, these demons plucked the Petrons from their harnesses and consumed their limbs. Their teeth were stronger than diamonds and cleared flesh and bone in a single bite. Once nothing remained of the Petrons but desecrated torsos, the demons would strap them back into their harnesses, where new limbs would sprout from their orifices like bloody saplings. The steel bars would then relock with tendon snapping force, and their woeful procession would continue towards the next demon. This process continued until the demons had had their fill, which required so many rotations around the cave that the Petrons lost count. Many of them went insane from the trauma of having their limbs continuously consumed, and gnawed off their tongues the moment their heads grew back. By most accounts, they spent months in this cave. Their wrinkled grey torsos developed rancid sores from the chains that spanned their chests and backs, and dripped pus incessantly down into the chasm below. Eventually, time lost all meaning for the Petrons. Their consciousnesses were consumed by nothing but pain, which dominated every moment of their pitiful lives. When this procession finally stopped, the Petrons cried out to God to save them from such incessant torture. God didn't respond, though, and instead, the alien mechanism thundering above their heads roared back into life and bore them slowly towards the chasm below. The demons stared at them longingly as they descended, as if at any moment they might resume their barbaric menagerie. The lower the Petrons sank, the hotter the air became. Eventually the temperature became so extreme that their eyeballs withered and sunk deep into their skulls. If it wasn't for the screams of their companions, which billowed around them like banshee shrieks, they would have been entirely without sense perceptions. As they continued their plunge into the depths below, their mouths met similar fate to their eyes, silencing even the loudest of their cries. After the Petrons sank for so long that their experiences in the cave became distant memory, the mechanism stopped, sending them jolting forward into their chains with such force that their ribs cracked. What follows is a torment so sinister that only the King of Shadows could devise it. Following a mechanical screech so jarring it exploded the Petrons' eardrums, their harnesses started spinning. This spinning doubled in speed every 10 seconds until the force of the air was enough to bruise their bodies. So violent did this speed become that the Petrons couldn't even form thoughts. All they could do was languish in their chains as their brains vibrated inside their skulls like locust wings. Accounts of how long this spinning continued varies from Petron to Petron. Some say it lasted no more than a few days, while others say it lasted for several years. Regardless, the vile experience they endured in this second room shattered what remained of their spirits and drove the majority of them past the brink of insanity. Well, the Petrons regained consciousness in the village square before this spinning concluded, which leaves me with countless questions. Would their harnesses have eventually propelled them into additional chambers, or is this violent spinning the final fate of poor souls cast into hell? Either option strikes fear in my heart, for both surpass the threshold of human endurance. Given the horrors the Petrons experienced during their pilgrimage, it's no wonder that many of them acted so crazed during the final moments of their lives. They were pushed well beyond the limits of suffering. Even the most heartless of villains would have had no choice but to take pity on their unfortunate souls. For this reason, I have to ask, why did God allow the Petrons to be cast into the pits of hell? They're model Christians. If not even their piety is enough to ascend to heaven, then we must certainly all be doomed. Can God really be so cruel? Does our Father truly have such lofty expectations for his children? If believing in Jesus Christ isn't enough to forgive us our sins, then what must we do in order to avoid a similar fate as the Petrons? Well, I leave you to be the judge, for my mind is growing weary and I must move on to my account of the children's experience while my candle still burns. My hand trembles as I reflect on the freakishness of their tale, which has left me with more questions regarding our faith than even the grotesque venture of their parents. I gathered the children into the pews of the sanctuary and ushered them in, one by one, into the pulpit so I could interview them. They were surprisingly eloquent for their ages, especially given the trauma they'd just endured. Descriptions of their pilgrimage poured from their mouths like milk and honey from the promised land, and painted such an abstruse picture of the afterlife that it left my heart galloping inside my chest. Unlike their parents, the children were overtaken by a blue light after their hearts stopped, rather than a red one. The light consumed their entire being. They became the light, and for a time lost all notions of self. But then this light exploded like yolk from a cracked egg, and sent them plummeting towards a landscape so alien I find it nearly impossible to rationalize. Towering trees dominated this landscape. Leaves bluer than the sky covered each jagged branch, which shook violently from the gusting wind. Each trunk was a different shade of white, and possessed so many wrinkles they looked like ancient skin. The children huddled under these trees as yellow rain began to pour from the sky. This rain fell in unbroken streams rather than single droplets, and despite the protection of the leaves, the children soon became soaked. So thick was this rain that they could hardly breathe. All they could do was clutch the withered trunks with trembling arms and pray that each breath they took wouldn't be their last. Just as the children were on the verge of panicking, 3 creatures came barreling through the trees behind them and scooped them up with massive arms. These creatures had human faces, but were missing mouths and noses. Instead, 2 sets of eyes dominated their ivory white skin, which blinked independently from each other. They had 4 arms and 4 legs and sucked in air through gaping, toothy orifices on their backs. The children clung on for dear life as these creatures whisked them away into a nearby cave. This cave stretched for miles and wound upwards rather than downwards. Its walls were made of smooth white rock that glistened from the light spilling from the creatures' eyes. The creatures placed the kids on their shoulders, grasped these walls with each of their appendages, and shimmied upwards like spiders. They moved with such speed that soon the children's arms ached from the effort of holding on. Air billowed around them like thunderstorm gusts, and blew their hair back from their brows. Eventually they came upon a sprawling chamber. The creatures placed them back onto the ground and then ushered them through the weathered archway that served as the chamber's entrance. This chamber was filled with every toy imaginable. Dolls, balls, swings, wooden swords, any toy that a youthful soul could ever want. Additionally, thousands of children were milling about the chamber, playing with these toys and each other as if they were siblings. Their joyous laughter echoed pleasantly off of the stone walls, and their footsteps reverberated through the air like notes from a perfectly tuned drum. The creatures gently pushed the petulant children toward the toys. Their eyes glimmered with mirth as they surveyed the lively scene in front of them, as if they were the loving parents of every child dancing through their shadows. After a few moments' hesitation, the patrons approached the toys and soon were bouncing around the alabaster walls with all of the other children. The fun they had in this chamber cannot be understated. Time slipped by in indeterminable chunks as they befriended every new child they came across and tested the diversity of toys like gluttons tasting wine at a symposium. Just as the patrons were beginning to feel at home in their new environment, a bass-filled chant exploded through the air, followed by a searing red light. The patrons watched as the children around them pivoted southwards and prostrated themselves. "The servants are coming," said a nearby child. "Whose servants?" said Claudius, the oldest of the patrons. "The servants of the grinning man." Before Claudius could respond, 6 entities similar to the demons the adults had encountered in the depths of hell ascended through a chasm in the middle of the chamber and landed silently on the stones. Their massive frames made the prostrated children below look like ants. The patrons watched as these entities plucked armfuls of children from the ground and disappeared back into the chasm. After the last entity vanished from sight, the chanting and red light vanished, and the children regained their feet and continued playing. "Where did they go?" asked Claudius, grabbing a passing boy by the arm. The other patrons were cowering behind him like frightened lambs. "To see the grinning man," said the boy, yanking his arm away. "Don't you know anything?" "Who's the grinning man?" "He's the king of this place. He takes care of us." "Where is he? I want to meet him." The boy laughed. "The only way to see the grinning man is if he chooses to bring you to his castle." "Where's that?" The boy pointed at the chasm. "Down there." Claudius's eyes drifted over to the hole, which split the ivory floor like a tar pit. "What happens at the grinning man's castle?" The boy shrugged his shoulders. "Nobody knows. None of the kids who've ever been taken there have returned." Before Claudius could respond, the boy picked up his ball and disappeared into the throng of children speeding behind them. Although the patrons were shaken by the spectacle they just witnessed, eventually the din of the hundreds of children dancing around them recommanded their attention, and they drifted back toward the toys. A few hours later, the ear-splitting chanting once again filled the chamber, followed by the blinding red light. The patrons watched in awe as the grinning man's servants burst through the chasm once more and landed 10 feet to their right. Despite the fear coursing through their veins like snake poison, their feet remained rooted to the ground, as if they were being constricted by an invisible force. They watched in horror as these entities scooped up a group of nearby children, then turned in their direction. "Stay behind me," said Claudius, doing his best to keep his voice calm. All 3 of the entities snapped their eyes onto his. "Grab him," said the largest of the entities. "His soul is worth that of 3 men. I can sense it." The patrons cried as Claudius was grabbed by a monstrous hand, then carried down the chasm looming beneath their feet like a cancerous sore. The frightened shrieks of the other children filled Claudius's ears as the entities plummeted down the chasm. They descended with such speed that the stone walls passed by in a blur. Soon Claudius's eyes stung from the force of the oscillating air, so he shut them and prayed that this nightmare would be over soon. They landed several minutes later on a bed of jet-black rocks. The children whimpered as their eyes were greeted by a pulsating red light. This light was sourceless and clogged the air as if it were a physical substance. Despite the fear clouding his vision like sheets of ice, Claudius remained outwardly calm. He knew that he needed to keep his wits if he ever wanted to reunite with his friends. So he remained thoughtful as the entities lurched forward into the narrow passageway in front of them, inquisitive minds straining to develop an escape plan. This passageway wound deep into the earth and was blanketed by a dense fog. The red light saturated this fog, giving it the appearance of bloody mist. The deeper they descended, the thicker this fog came, until eventually the children were gasping for air. No matter how valiantly they struggled to breathe, though, their lungs remained empty. It was as if the air had been replaced by water, and they were slowly drowning to death. Just as the children were moments away from blacking out, the entities shot out of this passageway like speeding arrows and entered a sprawling cavern. In the middle of this cavern towered a black structure unlike any Claudius had ever seen before. Obsidian walls undulated like jagged hills over a yellow, acidic lake, and were blacked by 3 hexagonal spires that stretched for miles into the phosphorescent air. These spires were dotted with large, barred windows, which shook from the yanking of invisible hands. The entities carried the children across the drawbridge spanning the lake and through the crimson door that served as the castle's entrance. Sitting at a desk just beyond this door was a red-skinned man. "How many?" he asked the entities, bored eyes half-heartedly scanning the children's faces. 26. The red-skinned man jotted the number down on the parchment in front of him. Thank you. Take them to storage. Without another word, the entities carried them into a hallway behind the desk. The hallway was lit by torches spaced intermittently around the Gothic walls, which cast ominous shadows onto the floor like insidious puppeteers. Eventually they came upon a staircase that wound deep under the floor. The entities carried them down this staircase, 2 steps at a time, then passed into a vast, dank cellar. This cellar was impossibly massive given its position in the castle, and was filled with black, coffin-like boxes. These boxes were stacked as far as Claudius's eyes could see, and emanated hoarse, guttural screams. "Get the boxes ready," said the largest entity to his partners. "I'll load them in." The other 2 entities grabbed armfuls of boxes from a nearby closet and spread them evenly across the floor. The sound of wood scraping across stone mixed with the muffled shrieks, causing the blood to drain from the children's faces. Once the entities were done opening the boxes, they receded into the background with their arms crossed behind their backs, like slaves awaiting their next command. After taking a moment to inspect the lids, the remaining entity grabbed the children and stuffed them inside the boxes, leaving only Claudius free from the claustrophobic prisons. Claudius watched in terror as he pounded massive black nails into the lids, then tossed the boxes on top of the nearest stack. The frightened shrieks of the children intermixed with the frantic crying of the other poor souls trapped inside the boxes, and soon became indistinguishable. They were like vermin trapped under the floorboards of a dilapidated house. They were completely ensnared by their wooden coffins, which loomed so closely over their panicked bodies they couldn't even raise their heads. "Don't you even think of running," said the entity, reading Claudius's mind. "You're needed in the inner sanctum." He turned his head towards the other entities. "Unload 10 boxes and do it quickly. We're behind schedule." The entities hurried over to the stacks, grabbed 10 boxes and placed them on the ground. They then tore off the lids with their bare hands, revealing pale, shivering bodies that barely looked human. "Stand up," said the largest entity. His command was met by crazed sobs. He surveyed the pitiful bodies languishing in front of him, then turned around to address the other entities. "Looks like their minds have spoiled. How long have they been incubating?" "About 600 years. He grunted. "Oh, they should still be ripe then. I suppose children are growing feebler. We'll shorten the incubation period to 500 years and see how they fare." "Yes, sir." "Grab them and follow me." Claudius was lifted into the air by a rough, fetid hand, which gripped his ribs so tightly he feared that they may crack. To his left and right dangled 2 children whose faces had gone blank from insanity. Their eyes were shriveled and crossed, and their tongues had been chewed down to pulpy stumps. It took all of the energy that Claudius could muster to remain calm. Panic threatened to overtake his every breath. He imagined having to suffer inside the castle for an eternity, and blinked back the tears forming behind his eyes. Eventually they came upon a glowing crimson door even more massive than the one that fronted the castle. Standing beside this door was the red-skinned man holding a wrinkled scroll. "You're late," he said, eyeing the largest entity. "Apologies, there were some delays. You know he hates being kept waiting." The entity cast his gaze towards the floor. "Regardless, I can see you've brought him quite the catch." He smiled at Claudius. "I have. May we enter?" "You may." The red-skinned man snapped his fingers. Behind him the crimson door spluttered to life and swung open on groaning hinges, revealing a colossal chamber. In the middle of this chamber towered an imposing black throne on which sat the most beautiful man Claudius had ever seen. The moment this man saw Claudius and the other children being carried into the chamber, He grinned. Never had Claudius felt so violated than as the grinning man's yellow eyes stroked his flesh through the shadows. He felt like a prize cattle standing in front of a butcher who at any moment could raise his knife and sever his jugular. Only the grinning man wanted his soul instead of his meat, and for what purpose Claudius shuddered to think. "Bring them closer," said the grinning man. "I want a better look at them." The entities heaved Claudius and his companions across the chamber. Their arms constricted from the force of their combined weight, sending the air blasting from Claudius's lungs. After performing a series of prostrations, the entities sat the children down on the black stones beneath the grinning man's feet. The grinning man's jagged throne loomed menacingly over their heads, making Claudius feel dizzy. "Wonderful," he continued. "They're perfect, especially him." He pointed at Claudius. "We only find a child with a soul as powerful as his once every millennium. Where is he from?" "Petra," said the largest entity. "He's a new arrival." "Interesting. It's been many long years since a Petran has walked through these doors." Claudius's skin writhed under the grinning man's gaze. He wanted nothing more than to flee from the chamber, but his legs felt lethargic and boneless beneath him. "Thank you, Master," said the entity. "That's why I skipped his incubation period. I figured that you would want to see him immediately." You thought right. By the time I'm through with him, he'll be one of my most powerful servants. The walls of this castle will tremble from the simple uttering of his name." He leaned forward on his throne and addressed Claudius. "Don't look so glum. Your life has a purpose now, and one far grander than any you can find in Rome." He rose to his feet. "Enough conversation. Let's begin." The grinning man strode across the chamber with such force the walls shook. His body grew with each step he took. By the time he reached the children, Claudius had to strain his neck just to see his face. Claudius watched in horror as his hands morphed into black, withered claws. These claws had disease-ridden orifices languishing in the middle of their palms, which pulsated with a menacing darkness. This darkness tainted the surrounding air and filled the chamber with a sordid haze. After taking a few moments to survey the children with his yellow eyes, the grinning man grabbed two of them with hooked talons and dragged them across the chamber. They screamed as their bare feet slid across the coarse stones, breaking their toes and lacerating their skin. What happened next to these poor children turns my stomach. How can such meek and innocent souls be forced to endure such blasphemies? Tears fill my eyes as I write this, for even the memory of their experience burdens my heart with dread. Once the children were only inches away from his feet, the grinning man reared back his arms and consumed their heads with the orifices in his palms. The children's bodies heaved and quivered as their faces were caressed by the darkness. The grinning man's face trembled with ecstasy as the children struggled to free themselves from his suction-like grasp. Their struggles only caused them to sink even deeper into his orifices, though, until eventually their necks passed into the toxic pits. Chills rippled across Claudius's body as their guttural screams sliced through the air. No matter how badly he wanted to help them, though, he knew that his attempt would end in disaster. The grinning man now towered 20 feet into the air. Not even the strength of 10 men could overpower him. All he could do was to sit there on the stones and wallow in despair as his companions descended into oblivion. The ensnared children floundered as first their torsos were consumed by the orifices, and then their legs. If it wasn't for the panicked shrieks reverberating through the chamber, Claudius would have thought that they'd been completely eviscerated. Several agonizing minutes later, the grinning man raised his hands into the air. His orifices opened with an ear-splitting snap, revealing 2 red-skinned men. Their bodies were remarkably similar to that of the 2 children's, but their bodies were supple and strong. "Your transformations are complete," said the grinning man. "May you serve in my kingdom for the rest of eternity. Leave now and attend to the duties I have bestowed upon you." The red-skinned man bowed and exited through the crimson doors. Now that the children had witnessed what would soon be their fates, they started sobbing uncontrollably. Even the cross-eyed children beside Claudius, whose minds he thought had fallen entirely dormant, wailed at the sight of the grinning man's dripping orifices. Only Claudius remained calm. His mind reeled from the effort of developing a means of escaping. No matter how hard he tried to think of suitable ideas, though, every time his eyes locked onto the grinning man's sadistic face, all of his epiphanies vanished into the putrid air. Grinning man grabbed 2 more children and consumed their bodies with his palms. These poor victims struggled even harder than the previous unfortunate souls. Their limbs jettisoned through the air like severed tentacles, and their screams reached such volume that their larynxes ruptured with an audible tear. But then the grinning man raised his arms once again into the air, and their screams morphed into joyous laughter as their bodies donned new flesh. Claudius watched in terror as the grinning man turned all of his companions into red-skinned men. Their cries wound through the air like animals being slaughtered, and were only silenced when their tormentor released his hold on their emaciated frames and sent their new bodies trundling through the crimson doors, hive minds kowtowing to his hypnotic commands. When only Claudius remained, the grinning man banished the entities from the chamber and regarded him with ravenous eyes. "It's only you and I now," he said. "Don't be afraid, I have such sights to show you." Claudius screamed as the grinning man wrapped his claws around his head and lifted him into the air. Pain exploded in his spine from the strain inflicted on his neck, but he resisted the urge to cry. He didn't want to give the grinning man the satisfaction of watching him suffer. When Claudius reached the base of his eyes, the grinning man paused. Yellow dominated the entirety of Claudius's vision. The grinning man's irises glowed like torches in front of him and radiated such heat that the saliva evaporated from his mouth. No matter how badly he wanted to look away, though, his gaze remained transfixed on the yellowness swimming before him, as if he were hypnotized. "Brace yourself," said the grinning man, "for your transformation will be an arduous process. When it's complete, your power will only be second to my own. Not even the angels in heaven will dare test your strength." Claudius's limbs went numb as an unseen force constricted his body. The sudden relaxation of his muscles caused his bowels to release and his arms to spasm. He couldn't even blink his eyes, much less struggle, as the luminosity of the grinning man's gaze intensified and sent bright dots dancing across his pupils. The brightness of the grinning man's irises increased to the point that Claudius feared he would go blind. Dark spots slid across his eyes like flowing lava, and were only broken up by patches of yellow and red. If his throat didn't feel like it had been stuffed with pounds of cotton, he would have screamed. Just as what remained of Claudius's vision was about to tumult into darkness, a tearing sound exploded above his head, and he and the grinning man went soaring into a shadow-filled room. Chained to the walls of this room were creatures so grotesque they made Claudius's stomach reel. Pus oozed from the pores of their yellow skin, and their faces were jagged and angular, as if their skulls had been partially crushed. "Don't be frightened," said the grinning man. "These are my children. They won't harm you." The creatures howled at the sound of the grinning man's voice, like hounds reunited with their long-absent master. Immediately after their cries died in their throats, they pulled against their chains with all of their might in an attempt to free themselves. Luckily, the black metal held firm. "They are soulless. That's why their behavior is so erratic." If the grinning man's claws weren't wrapped around his shoulders, Claudius would have bolted from the room. Never before had he witnessed such psychotic behavior. The creatures writhing in front of him would have torn each other to shreds if their chains weren't so powerful. Instead, They eyed each other hungrily through the darkness, as if they were fighting to prove their ferociousness to the grinning man. "I can sense your soul. It has been many centuries since one of their siblings has received such a profound gift, and they are desperate to tear away your flesh. Worry not, though. I won't allow them to succumb to such base behavior. I'm a civilized man. Your union will be controlled and deliberate, as tradition demands." Claudius cringed as the grinning man's claws dug deeper into his flesh. Blood poured from his wounds in crimson streams and plastered his tunic to his back. The copper scent of his blood sent the creatures spiraling into a frenzy. They struggled against their chains with such force dust rained down from the ceiling. They then howled like feral dogs fighting over a bone as they sniffed the air. But the grinning man said something in a language Claudius had never heard before, and they all fell silent. "They are growing restless. Pick the one you want to merge with, and we will begin." Claudius stared down at the ground. Like the fabled Spartans of Greece, he had accepted his death, and refused to either struggle against or aid the grinning man as he performed his demented ritual. "Silence will not save you. If you refuse to choose, then the contest will decide your fate, as it has countless souls before you." Claudius remained silent. "Still you abstain. Fine. Let the contest proceed." The grinning man dripped a pool of Claudius's blood onto the middle of the floor with a hooked talon, then snapped his fingers and released the creatures from their chains. The creatures threw themselves at one another like rabid wolves. Black blood cascaded through the air and splattered against the walls as their teeth ripped flesh from bone. Only their guttural howls could be heard over the incessant tearing, which ripped through the air like cacophonous banshee shrieks. Eventually their teeth found each other's throats and sent their howls tumbling out of the open wounds in their necks. Black blood poured down their bodies in viscous rivulets, making their withered yellow skin look like rotten viper husks in the shadows. The grinning man's claws tightened around Claudius's shoulders and very nearly sliced through his tendons. Claudius hardly noticed the pain, though, for his attention was consumed by the malicious menagerie wreaking havoc in front of him. As the fight wore on, the brutal violence became too much for Claudius to bear. Not even his monumental bravery could influence him to continue watching as the creatures devoured each other's limbs with teeth sharper than tempered steel. So he closed his eyes and tried to imagine what he was back home in Petra, laying beneath the trees behind his home, or running through the meadow beyond the village outskirts. When the gruesome sounds finally ceased several minutes later, he opened his eyes. Crouched in the middle of the chamber was a single creature whose mouth was caked with the gore of his siblings. Its yellow eyes stared longingly at him, as if it could already taste his soul. "Ah, we have a match," said the grinning man, "and what a match it will be. Your union will shake the pillars of heaven and cause even God to tremble." Claudius closed his eyes as the grinning man tightened his grip on his shoulders. He could feel his putrid breath crashing against the back of his neck like furnace fumes, and resisted the urge to gag. The surviving creature clambered forward through the shadows. Black blood oozed from its lacerated skin as it crawled on all fours across the colorless stones, clawed hands reaching for Claudius like spectral knives, hurtling through a pool of murky water. "Don't resist," said the grinning man. "Only a handful of souls have had the privilege of merging with one of my sons. You're receiving a marvelous gift." Claudius shivered as the creature wrapped a blood-smeared hand around his ankle. His shin exploded with pain from the force of its grip, which was tight enough to crumple steel. "The bond has been made. Your souls will soon intertwine. Tales of your union will echo through hell for an eternity." Claudius screamed as the skin surrounding the creature's claw turned black. His nerve endings writhed as an alien sensation spread rapidly across his leg, which felt like dozens of hornets simultaneously jamming their stingers deep into his paws. before his mind hardly had time to register, much less rationalize, the decomposition of his skin, the creature's hand began to sink deep within the blackened husk that had once been his leg. Such pain accompanied his sudden merging, he would have blacked out if it wasn't for the adrenaline pumping through his veins like gelatinous opium. For the first time since entering the nightmarish chamber, Claudius offered up a desperate prayer to God. Although, like all men, he was a sinner, surely his sins weren't deserving of such a brutal punishment. He was only a child, after all. Did God not pity the innocent and reward the faithful, like in the Bible passages his mother read to him before bed? Despite the urgency of his prayers, Claudius's pitiful pleas went unanswered, and the creature wrapped his other claw around his arm and dragged him to the ground. The force of the creature's pulling shattered his collarbone and sent stars dancing across his tear-stained vision. He grimaced as shards of bone went tearing through his flesh, causing warm blood to spill down upon his chest. His pain was quickly forgotten, though, as the creature's arm began to merge with his own, creating a sensation so detestable his heart rate tripled. Claudius tried to pull away from the creature spluttering before him, but his struggles did nothing but hasten the merging of their limbs. His arm and leg was now entirely consumed by its yellow flesh, and his face was no more than 2 feet away from its snarling mouth. It was as his eyes locked onto the bloodshot corneas of his assailant that he first felt an insidious presence slithering through his consciousness. This presence felt inhuman and evil, as if it were an extension of the creature's solid aura. Claudius's vision darkened as his soul became tainted with this twisted presence. He could sense its vile thoughts as clearly as his own, and trembled as a single word dominated his awareness. Mate. The creature grabbed his arm and yanked him on top of its body. Their skin formed a singular black mass that hissed and gurgled as his pale skin melted from his bones. Despite the agony threatening to tumult his sanity into oblivion, he ignored this pain, for all he could focus on was the demented consciousness overtaking his own. Just as what remained of his soul was moments away from being consumed by the creature, a searing red light erupted in the chamber. This light exploded the grinning man's eyes and sent him plummeting to the ground. Floating in the middle of this light was a faceless black mass that undulated across the stones in spasmodic leaps. Although this shadow silhouette possessed arms and legs, it was clearly inhuman, and exuded such malice that it made the creature writhing on top of Claudius look like a newborn pup. "Master," said the grinning man, black blood splashing down his cheeks. "Your arrival comes as a surprise." A booming voice echoed across the chamber. This voice was pure bass, and spoke such a vile-sounding language that each syllable constricted Claudius's lungs. The grinning man bristled as this voice washed over him, then struggled to his feet. "I don't understand," he said. "The children were promised to me. Why interfere?" The booming voice uttered a single sound with such authority that it sent the grinning man plummeting back to his knees. "Yes, master. I understand. Please, forgive my insolence. The boy is yours to do with as you please." The grinning man snapped his fingers. Claudius's limbs were released from the creature's hold. He breathed a sigh of relief as the creature's tainted presence flooded from his spirit, and he regained full control of his consciousness. His relief didn't last long, though. For a few moments later, he was lifted into the air by an invisible force and went careening, head first, into the black mass dominating the chamber. Darkness flooded Claudius's entire being. Scalding tendrils of pure blackness snaked across his body, burning his skin and filling his mouth and nose with a fetid stench. Never before had he felt such despair. The black mass writhing around him radiated cruelty like burning coal does heat, robbing him of all mobility. All he could do was languish in the air as his life force leapt from his deteriorating body. Just as he was about to scream from the agony splitting his nerves, A malicious presence entered his consciousness and silenced his scream inside his throat. This presence felt exponentially more powerful than the creatures and filled him with despair. He tried to resist this presence as it infiltrated his spirit, but his struggles were pointless. He could no more combat such unspeakable evil than a fly can a titan. So he relinquished his soul to the blackness billowing around him like biting hurricane winds, and shuddered as what remained of his awareness was buried under a mountain of hatred and wickedness. The last thing he remembered before regaining consciousness in Petra was a booming voice endlessly repeating the same message inside his head. God is dead. By the time Claudius finished his account, night had descended over Petra, and my inkpot was nearly empty. The pulpit was illuminated by a single candle, which sent our shadows cascading into the first row of pews. I leaned back in my chair, trying desperately to rationalize such a harrowing interview. No matter how hard I pondered the child's words, though, my face remained visibly shaken. I felt like my faith had been irreparably tarnished. How could I believe in a God that allowed such cruelties to be inflicted on his faithful children? If the results of my experiment are accurate, which I believe them to be, then we must come to terms with the simple truth. Hell is coming for us all. God is not as merciful as he appears to be. Simply believing in his righteousness is not enough to cleanse us of our sins. Man has fallen into a pit far too deep to climb out of, and I fear that he will languish there for the rest of eternity. With this frightful revelation reverberating incessantly through my mind, I escorted Claudius and the other children back to their homes, then drifted off into a light sleep, plagued with brutal nightmares. When I awoke the next morning, all of the Petran children were missing. The chapel had also been desecrated. Slaughtered goats and cattle were strewn across the pews, which were swarmed with buzzing flies. Scrawled below the cross towering above the pulpits was a single message written in blood. God is dead. Well, viewing figures tend to suggest that you really are enjoying this series of stories about the Vatican Archives, and I am in love with them all. Some of the finest writing I've seen in quite a long time, and I have the very distinct pleasure of being almost in a unique position to read these all for you, thanks to the fantastic work of the author. And, well, I hope you're going to do me those little favours again. Go to his channel, which I've linked to in the video description. Watch some of his videos, click like, subscribe of course, and leave lots of comments. He's simply phenomenal, and I just hope you are going to continue to enjoy all of his work. Well, my dear friends, I will be back again very soon, of course. Till then, happy Easter, and, well, see you again soon. Stay safe. Till then, bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.